A kiss that started a war. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love, not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was forced into a marriage she did not choose, she realized something brutal. This was not a wedding. This was a claim. Marcello Ricci smirked, his fingers ghosting over her pulse. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I've always liked breaking pretty things." Chapter 1. The Crushing Weight of Legacy. The insistent ringing of the antique telephone sliced through the quiet hum of the DeSantis villa, a jarring intrusion into Alessia's carefully constructed sanctuary. Rain lashed against the tall windows of her study, mirroring the tempest brewing within her. She'd been staring at the unfinished canvas, a swirl of grays and blacks that reflected the turmoil in her soul, for hours. Painting, once her escape, now felt like another cage, the colors mocking her inability to capture the vibrant life she craved. She picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly.
Pronto?
Her Uncle Sal's voice, gravelly and strained, crackled through the line. "Alessia, it's your father." The world tilted. A cold dread seeped into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. "What is it? What's happened?" He hesitated, the silence stretching, heavy and suffocating. "There's been an incident. At the docks. You need to come."
Now.
The docks. Her father's domain, the heart of the DeSantis empire, a place of hushed deals and shadowy figures. A place she'd always been kept away from, shielded from the brutal realities of their world. But the tremor in Sal's voice, the uncharacteristic waver, told her this was no ordinary incident. She dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. Her legs felt heavy, leaden, as she moved towards the door. The scent of oil paints, usually comforting, now choked her, a reminder of the life she was leaving behind, perhaps forever. The drive to the docks was a blur. The city lights, usually so vibrant, seemed muted, distant. The rain continued to fall, blurring the windshield, obscuring the world outside. Each swipe of the wipers felt like a countdown, ticking away the seconds of her old life. As they neared the docks, the scene that unfolded before her was one of controlled chaos. Police cars, their flashing blue lights painting the wet asphalt in an eerie, pulsating glow, were clustered around a warehouse. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, holding back a throng of onlookers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. She pushed past the officers, ignoring their protests, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sal met her at the edge of the cordon, his face etched with grief, his eyes red-rimmed. He didn't speak, just wrapped her in a tight embrace, the scent of his familiar cologne, a blend of sandalwood and tobacco, a small comfort in the swirling storm. He led her towards the warehouse, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Inside, the scene was even more gruesome. Her father, Don Antonio DeSantis, the man who had always seemed invincible, lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A single crimson stain bloomed on his crisp white shirt, a stark and brutal testament to his mortality. Alessia felt a scream building in her throat, but it died there, trapped by a lifetime of enforced composure. She knelt beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek, still warm, but already losing the vibrancy of life. She traced the lines of his face, the strong jaw, the aquiline nose, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a long-forgotten feud. Memories flooded her, his booming laughter, the warmth of his embrace, the stern but loving lectures.
Gone.
All gone. Sal placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. It was the Riccis, Alessia. A message. The Riccis. Their longtime rivals, their sworn enemies. The name hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A cold, calculating rage began to replace the initial shock, a burning ember in the icy wasteland of her grief. A message? She whispered, her voice hoarse. What kind of message? They want control of the docks. Your father refused, he always refused. Sal's voice broke. He was protecting you, Alessia. He knew what this would mean. Alessia looked up, her eyes meeting Sal's. What does it mean, Uncle? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the lifeless form of his brother. It means you're in danger. The Ricci's won't stop. They never stop. The weight of her legacy, the crushing weight of the DeSantis name, settled upon her shoulders. She was no longer just Alessia, the artist, the dreamer. She was Alessia DeSantis, the daughter of a murdered Don, the heir to a shattered empire. Later that night, back at the villa, the silence was even more profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The portraits of her ancestors, lining the walls of the grand hall, seemed to stare down at her, their eyes filled with judgment and expectation. Sal sat across from her, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. There's only one way, Alessia. Only one way to protect yourself, to protect the family. She knew what he was going to say. She'd always known, deep down, that this day might come. A day when the gilded cage of her life would be replaced by a different kind of confinement. A marriage, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Sal nodded, his expression grim.
Alliance.
A strong alliance. Someone who can stand against the Ricci's. Someone respected. And who is this respected someone? She asked, though a sickening premonition was already taking root in her heart. He took a deep breath. Marcello Ricci. The name struck her like a physical blow. Marcello Ricci, the heir to the Ricci Empire. The man known for his ruthlessness, his charm, his cold, calculating eyes. The man who, even from afar, had always sent a shiver of unease down her spine. The serpent in their garden. No, she whispered, the word a desperate plea. Anyone but him. There is no one else, Alessia. He's the only one strong enough. He made the offer himself. After what happened, Sal couldn't meet her eyes. A marriage proposal, delivered on the heels of her father's murder. A calculated move, a power play disguised as an act of what? Mercy? She doubted it. He wants to protect me? She asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. He wants the docks. He wants the DeSantis power. But he also understands the code. He knows that by marrying you, he takes on the responsibility of protecting you. It's a twisted kind of honor. Honor. Among thieves and murderers. The word felt hollow, meaningless. And if I refuse? Sal finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. You won't survive, Alessia. They'll come for you. They'll finish what they started. She stood up, walking towards the window, her reflection staring back at her, a pale ghost in the darkened glass. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting a fragile light on the sprawling gardens below. She saw her father there, tending to his roses, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. A memory, a phantom, a reminder of what she had lost. She turned back to Sal, her decision made. Not out of love, not out of desire, but out of a primal need to survive, to protect what little remained of her family, of her father's legacy. Tell him, she said, her voice steady, devoid of emotion. Tell Marcello Ricci, I accept. The word hung in the air, a vow uttered in chains, a promise made under duress. She felt a tear trace a path down her cheek, the first of many, she suspected. But beneath the grief, beneath the fear, a flicker of defiance ignited. She would marry Marcello Ricci. She would play his game, but she would not be broken. She would find a way to turn this gilded cage into a weapon, to use his own twisted code against him. She would survive. And perhaps one day, she would even find a way to be free. But for now, all she could do was pray. The meeting, the wedding, the claiming was tomorrow. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Gilded Cage. The dawn arrived, not with the gentle promise of a new day, but with the heavy cloak of impending doom. Alessia hadn't slept. She'd spent the night pacing the confines of her room, the walls closing in on her, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow to her already fragile composure. She'd chosen a simple black dress, a stark contrast to the elaborate white gown she'd once dreamed of wearing on her wedding day. A day that was supposed to be filled with joy, with love, with hope. Now, it was a day of mourning, of submission, of a terrifying unknown. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes, a pale face, and a set jaw. She barely recognized herself. Gone was the carefree artist, the woman who found solace in colors and brushstrokes. In her place stood a figure carved from ice and steel, a woman forced to confront a reality she'd always been shielded from. The villa, usually bustling with activity, was eerily quiet. The servants moved like shadows, their faces somber, their eyes avoiding hers. They all knew, this was not a celebration, but a sacrifice. Sal arrived, his face drawn and pale. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply nodded, his eyes conveying a silent understanding. He knew the weight of the burden she was carrying, the unfairness of it all. "He's waiting," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The he was unnecessary.
Marcello Ricci.
The name echoed in her mind, a constant, throbbing reminder of her fate. The meeting was to take place in her father's study, a room steeped in history and power. The very air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of past decisions, past deals, past betrayals. The scent of leather and old books, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He was already there, standing by the window, his back to her. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad, his presence commanding. He turned as she entered, and her breath caught in her throat. Marcello Ricci was undeniably handsome, in a dangerous, predatory way. His eyes, a startling shade of green, were sharp and assessing, taking in every detail of her appearance. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a strong jawline and a faint scar that traced a path along his cheekbone, a mirror image of her father's, a chilling reminder of the violence that bound them. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, that emphasized his powerful physique. He exuded an aura of controlled power, of barely suppressed menace. He offered a small, almost imperceptible bow. "Alessia." His voice was smooth, like velvet over steel, a voice that could charm and threaten in the same breath. She didn't return the courtesy. "Ricci." He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No need for formalities. We are to be family, after all." Family. The word twisted in her gut. "This isn't about family," she said, her voice cold. "This is about power. About control." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Is there a difference?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on his. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her vulnerability. He gestured towards a chair. "Please sit." She remained standing. "Let's get this over with." He shrugged, unfazed by her defiance. "As you wish." He walked towards her father's desk, the very desk where he'd likely negotiated the terms of her father's demise, of her own subjugation. He picked up a document, its pages crisp and new, the ink still smelling fresh. "The agreement," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Standard clauses. Transfer of assets. Shared control of the territories. And, of course, the vow of protection." He placed the document on the desk, offering her a pen. A gold pen, engraved with the Ricci family crest, a coiled serpent, its fangs bared. A symbol of their power, of their ruthlessness. She stared at the pen, her hand trembling. Signing this document meant signing away her freedom, her future. It meant accepting a life she didn't choose, a life bound to a man she despised. But she had no choice. She thought of her father, of his sacrifice. She thought of the servants, the families who depended on the DeSantis name, the lives that would be shattered if she refused. She took the pen, her fingers gripping it tightly, as if it were a lifeline. She signed her name, Alessia DeSantis, the letters bold and defiant, a small act of rebellion in a sea of submission. He signed his own name, Marcello Ricci, with a flourish, the signature of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He folded the document, placing it in a leather-bound folder.
"It's done, then."
She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and resignation.
"Is it?"
He smiled again, that same chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. The formalities are. The claiming remains. He stepped closer, his proximity unsettling. She could smell his cologne, a subtle blend of citrus and spice, a scent that would forever be associated with this moment, with this betrayal. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and threatening. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "You belong to me now, Alessia," he whispered, his voice low and intimate. Body and soul. She met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "I belong to no one but myself." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that echoed in the silence. "We shall see." The wedding ceremony was a mockery. A small, private affair held in the villa's chapel, the stained glass windows casting colored shadows on the stone floor. The priest, a nervous, fidgety man, rushed through the vows, his voice barely audible. There were no guests, only Sal and a few of Ricci's men, their faces impassive, their eyes watchful. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just a cold, sterile exchange of promises, a binding of two souls under the shadow of death and deceit. When it was over, Marcello leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're my wife now, Alessia." "My property." The last two words spoken with a venomous purr. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears, the anger, the despair. She was trapped. Trapped in a gilded cage, bound to a man who saw her as nothing more than a possession, a prize to be won. But even in the darkness, a spark of hope remained. She would endure. She would survive. And she would find a way to break free, to reclaim her life, to avenge her father. The game had begun, and Alessia DeSantis was not one to surrender. The first night loomed ahead, a night she had been dreading, a night of forced intimacy, a night where she will feel all semblance of control given away. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Palazzo. The Palazzo Ricci was a stark contrast to the familiar warmth of the DeSantis villa. It was grander, more imposing, a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and power. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries and imposing portraits of Ricci ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow Alessia as she walked through the vast, echoing halls. The air was heavy with the scent of old money and unspoken secrets, a suffocating atmosphere that made her long for the fresh, open spaces of her former home. Marcello had been surprisingly civil. He hadn't forced himself on her the first night, a small mercy she hadn't expected. He'd simply shown her to her room, a lavish suite overlooking the city, with a balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the glittering lights below. It was a beautiful prison, a gilded cage designed to keep her comfortable, but confined. "Make yourself comfortable," he'd said, his voice neutral, his eyes unreadable. "Dinner will be served at 8. And then he'd left, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her fears, her simmering resentment. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Alessia spent most of her time exploring the palazzo, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine corridors and hidden rooms. She discovered a vast library, filled with ancient tomes and leather-bound manuscripts, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the words of others, escaping the suffocating reality of her own life. She found a neglected garden, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, a hidden oasis where she could breathe the fresh air and feel the sun on her skin. The servants, mostly older women with tight lips and watchful eyes, treated her with a mixture of deference and suspicion. They answered her questions, but offered little else. They were loyal to Marcello, to the Ricci family, and she was an outsider, an intruder, a threat. She rarely saw Marcello. He was always busy, attending to business, a euphemism for the shadowy dealings that were the lifeblood of the Ricci empire. He'd leave early in the morning, often before she woke, and return late at night, sometimes not at all. When they did interact, it was usually at dinner, a formal affair served in a grand dining room, with a long, polished table that could seat 20. They sat at opposite ends, the vast space between them a symbol of the chasm that separated their worlds. The conversations were stilted, polite, devoid of any real connection. He'd ask about her day. She'd offer vague answers. He'd talk about business. She'd listen, her mind elsewhere. It was a charade, a performance for the benefit of the servants, who were always present, hovering in the shadows, their ears attuned to every word. But sometimes, she'd catch him watching her, his green eyes intense and probing, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden beneath her carefully constructed facade. And in those moments, she felt a flicker of something. Not fear, not exactly, but a strange, unsettling awareness, a recognition of the power he held over her, of the danger he represented. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, he surprised her by asking, "Do you miss it?" She looked up startled. "Miss what?" "Painting," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your art." She hesitated, surprised by the question. She hadn't touched a brush since her father's death, the joy of creation replaced by a hollow ache. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on hers. "I found some of your work. In your father's study. Landscapes.
Portraits.
Quite impressive." She felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She hadn't realized he'd seen her paintings. "They were just sketches," she mumbled. "They were more than that," he said, his voice firm. "They were alive." He paused, then added, "There's a studio here, in the East Wing. It hasn't been used in years. You're welcome to it if you wish." She stared at him, surprised by the offer. It was the first genuine gesture of kindness, perhaps, that he'd shown her. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. He shrugged, dismissing her gratitude. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, a glimpse of something human beneath the ruthless exterior. Later that night, she found herself wandering towards the East Wing, drawn by the promise of the studio. She found it at the end of a long, dusty corridor, a large, airy room with tall windows that overlooked the city. It was filled with old furniture, covered in dust sheets, and stacks of canvases, their surfaces blank and waiting. The air was thick with the scent of dried paint and forgotten dreams. She pulled off the dust sheets, revealing easels, palettes, and brushes, all coated in a layer of dust. She found a box of paints, their tubes cracked and dried, but still holding the promise of color. She picked up a brush, her fingers tracing its familiar shape. She felt a spark ignite within her, a flicker of the passion she'd thought she'd lost.
She didn't paint that night.
But she knew she would. She would return to this sanctuary, to this space where she could be herself, where she could express the emotions that were churning within her. As she left the studio, she heard a whisper, a voice from the shadows. "He watches you, Signora." She turned, startled, to see one of the older servants, a woman named Maria, her face etched with concern. "Watches me?" Alessia asked, her heart beating faster. Maria nodded, her eyes darting nervously around the corridor. "He watches everything. Be careful, Signora. This place, it holds secrets. Dangerous secrets." And then she disappeared, melting back into the shadows, leaving Alessia alone with her unease, with the growing sense that the Palazzo Ricci was not just a gilded cage, but a web of intrigue and danger, a place where whispers held more truth than spoken words. Alessia knew that Maria was warning her, that perhaps Marcello was far more dangerous than Alessia had ever imagined. And now, the game felt far more complicated. Chapter 4. A Dance of Defiance. The studio became Alessia's refuge, her sanctuary within the suffocating confines of the Palazzo Ricci. She spent hours there, rediscovering the joy of creation, the solace of expressing her emotions through color and form. She cleaned the space, removing the dust and cobwebs, breathing life back into the forgotten room. She replaced the dried-up paints with new ones, vibrant hues that mirrored the reawakening of her spirit. She started with simple sketches, hesitant at first, her hand unsure after the long hiatus. But gradually, her confidence returned, her strokes becoming bolder, more assured. She painted the cityscapes she saw from the windows, the towering buildings and winding streets, capturing the energy, and the darkness of the world outside. She painted the overgrown garden, the wild beauty of the untamed flowers, a reflection of her own yearning for freedom. And sometimes she painted Marcello. Not portraits, not exactly, but impressions, fragments of his image captured on canvas. His eyes, sharp and intense. His hands, strong and capable, but also capable of cruelty. His shadow, looming and menacing. She didn't show these paintings to anyone. They were too personal, too revealing. They were a way for her to explore her complex feelings towards him, the mixture of fear, resentment, and a strange, undeniable fascination. Marcello, to her surprise, didn't intrude on her time in the studio. He'd given her the space, and he respected her privacy. But she knew he was aware of her activities. She'd catch him watching her sometimes, from across the dining room or from the hallway outside the studio, his expression unreadable. One evening, as she was cleaning her brushes, he appeared at the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach, his footsteps silent on the thick carpets. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the room. She hesitated, her heart beating faster. She'd never allowed anyone into her sanctuary, especially not him. But she nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He walked around the room, his eyes taking in the canvases, the sketches, the scattered tubes of paint. He stopped in front of one of her cityscapes, a view of the palazzo from across the river, the building bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. She felt a flush of pride, a warmth that spread through her chest. "Thank you." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "You capture the light and the darkness."
Both.
She met his eyes, her own unwavering. "There's both in everything." He nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He moved closer, his proximity unsettling. She could smell his cologne, that familiar blend of citrus and spice, a scent that both intrigued and repelled her. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a canvas where she'd painted his shadow, a dark, menacing figure looming over a cityscape. "And what is this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't flinch. "It's what I see." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You see me as a monster?" "I see you as you are," she replied, her voice steady. He stepped even closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the barely suppressed power that emanated from his every pore. "And what am I, Alessia?" he whispered, his breath warm on her cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes locked with his. "You're a man who hides behind a mask, a man who uses power to control others, a man who killed my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger, perhaps, or something else. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer excuses. He simply said, "And you're a woman who challenges me, a woman who refuses to be broken, a woman who intrigues me." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "This dance we're doing, Alessia, it's dangerous, but also exhilarating." He pulled back, his eyes still locked with hers. "Don't mistake my tolerance for weakness. I could break you if I wanted to, but I find myself curious. Curious to see how far you'll push me. Curious to see how long you'll resist." She didn't answer, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. He held all the power. He could crush her with a word, a gesture. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She wouldn't cower. He smiled, that slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The game continues, then." And he left, leaving her alone in the studio, her heart racing, her mind swirling with a mixture of fear and a strange, undeniable excitement. The dance had become more dangerous, the stakes higher. But she was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was a player, a challenger, a woman who was beginning to find her own power, her own strength. The next day, she found a new easel in the studio, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship made of dark, polished wood. Beside it was a set of brushes, the finest sable, their handles inlaid with silver. A gift. From Marcello. A silent acknowledgement of her talent, of her defiance. A challenge. And a promise. Tonight was the night the families gathered. The night where alliances were tested and strengthened. The night where, even if she had a target on her back, Alessia would have to dance among vipers and pretend to be one of them. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Charm. The gathering was held in the grand ballroom of the Palazzo Ricci, a vast, opulent space designed to impress and intimidate. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high, vaulted ceiling, casting a dazzling light on the polished marble floors and gilded walls. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of hushed conversations, a symphony of power and intrigue. Alessia had chosen a dress of deep emerald green, a color that echoed Marcello's eyes, a subtle act of defiance, a way of claiming a piece of his power for herself. The fabric flowed around her like liquid silk, accentuating her figure, making her feel both vulnerable and empowered. She'd spent hours preparing, meticulously applying her makeup, styling her hair, transforming herself into a woman who could hold her own in this world of vipers. She was no longer the naive artist, the sheltered daughter. She was Alessia DeSantis Ricci, a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the Mafia world. Marcello, when he saw her, offered a slow, appreciative smile. "You look stunning," he said, his voice low and intimate. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "As do you." He was dressed in a black tuxedo, impeccably tailored, that emphasized his powerful physique. He exuded an aura of effortless elegance and barely suppressed menace, a serpent in a perfectly crafted suit. He offered her his arm, and she took it, her fingers lightly resting on his sleeve. It was a gesture of unity, of partnership, a performance for the benefit of the assembled guests. But beneath the surface, the tension between them simmered, a constant reminder of the dangerous game they were playing. As they entered the ballroom, all eyes turned towards them. The murmur of conversation subsided, replaced by a hush of anticipation. They were the center of attention, the newly formed alliance, the union of two powerful families. Alessia recognized many of the faces. The heads of other families, their wives and daughters, their lieutenants and soldiers. They were all there, the players in this intricate game of power, their eyes assessing, calculating, judging. She felt a wave of nausea, a surge of claustrophobia. She wanted to run, to escape this suffocating atmosphere, to return to the sanctuary of her studio. But she couldn't. She had a role to play, a performance to deliver. Marcello guided her through the crowd, introducing her to the key players, his voice smooth and charming, his hand resting possessively on her waist. He was the perfect host, the consummate politician, weaving his way through the intricate web of alliances and rivalries. She listened to the conversations, the veiled threats and subtle negotiations, the carefully worded insults and insincere compliments. She learned to read the unspoken language of the Mafia world, the subtle gestures and coded phrases, the hidden agendas and shifting loyalties. She saw the way the other women looked at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of envy and suspicion. They saw her as a threat, an outsider, a woman who had dared to marry into their world. But she also saw the way the men looked at her, their eyes lingering on her figure, their expressions a mixture of admiration and lust. She was a prize, a possession, a symbol of Marcello's power. She met their gazes, her own unwavering, her expression carefully neutral. She wouldn't show them any weakness, any vulnerability. She would play their game, and she would play it well. One man, in particular, caught her attention. Don Angelo Vitali, the head of a rival family, a man known for his ruthlessness and his ambition. He was older than Marcello, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes cold and calculating. He approached them, his smile a predatory curve of his lips. "Marcello, my friend," he said, his voice gravelly. "Congratulations on your acquisition." Marcello's grip on Alessia's waist tightened, a subtle warning. "Don Vitali," he replied, his voice smooth. "A pleasure to see you." Vitali's gaze shifted to Alessia, his eyes raking over her figure. And this is the beautiful Alessia. A prize worthy of a king. Alessia met his gaze, her own unflinching. I am no one's prize, Don Vitali, she said, her voice clear and steady. Vitali chuckled, a low, throaty sound. Brave words, Signora Ricci. But we all know who holds the leash. Marcello's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. Watch your tongue, Vitali, he warned, his voice dangerously low. Vitali shrugged, unfazed. Just admiring your property, Marcello. A rare beauty.
Ashamed to keep her locked away.
Alessia felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards this man who dared to speak to her as if she were an object, a possession. But before she could respond, Marcello stepped in front of her, shielding her from Vitali's gaze. My wife is not for your amusement, Vitali, he said, his voice cold and deadly. And I suggest you remember that. Vitali met his gaze, his own eyes narrowed. The two men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills, a clash of power. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Finally, Vitali broke the silence, offering a small, mocking bow. As you wish, Marcello. My apologies. I meant no offense. But Alessia knew he did. He was testing Marcello, probing for weaknesses, looking for an opportunity. He was a predator, and he saw her as prey. The encounter left her shaken, but also strangely exhilarated. She had stood up to Vitali, and Marcello had defended her. It was a small victory, a moment of defiance in this world of carefully orchestrated power plays. As the evening progressed, Alessia began to understand the intricate dance of the Mafia world, the constant shifting of alliances, the subtle betrayals, the ever-present threat of violence. She also began to see a different side of Marcello. He was not just a ruthless, cold-blooded killer. He was also a skilled negotiator, a charismatic leader, a man who commanded respect and loyalty.
He was a serpent, yes.
But a serpent with a certain charm. The night wore on, and Alessia couldn't shake off the dangerous feeling that she would need to keep her wits about her. Every second. Especially when she had just made a formidable enemy in Don Vitali. Chapter 6. Echoes of Lost Freedom. The days following the gathering settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. Alessia continued to find solace in her studio, the canvases becoming a visual diary of her conflicted emotions. She painted less of the cityscapes now, and more of the internal landscape of her heart, a turbulent mix of fear, anger, resentment, and a growing, unsettling fascination with Marcello. She still saw very little of him during the day. He was consumed by business, the details of which he never shared with her. But their evenings took on a new dynamic. He started joining her in the studio, sometimes simply watching her paint, his presence a silent, watchful force in the room. Other times, he'd talk, sharing fragments of his own past, his own struggles, his own losses. He told her about his childhood, growing up in the shadow of his father, a demanding, ruthless man who had groomed him from birth to take over the family empire. He spoke of the weight of responsibility, the constant pressure to prove himself, the lack of choice in his own destiny. He never spoke of love, of affection, of any of the softer emotions. But she sensed a deep loneliness beneath his carefully constructed facade, a yearning for something he couldn't name, something he'd been denied. She, in turn, shared fragments of her own past, her childhood spent in the sheltered world of the DeSantis villa, her passion for art, her dreams of a life beyond the confines of the Mafia world. She spoke of her father, of his love and his protectiveness, of the void his death had left in her life. These conversations were tentative, guarded, like two wary animals circling each other, unsure whether to trust, whether to attack. But they were also a bridge, a fragile connection between two souls trapped in a world not of their own making. One evening, he brought her a gift. A small, antique music box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and silver. He placed it on her workbench, his fingers lingering on its surface. I found it in the attic, he said, his voice soft. It belonged to my grandmother. She used to play it for me when I was a child. Alessia opened the box, and a delicate melody filled the room, a haunting tune that spoke of lost innocence and faded dreams. She felt a lump form in her throat, a wave of unexpected emotion. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded, his gaze fixed on hers. "It reminded me of you." She looked up at him, surprised.
Why?
He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It's fragile and beautiful and resilient." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, perhaps? Or something more. She closed the music box, the melody fading into silence. "Thank you, Marcello," she said, her voice sincere. He met her gaze, his eyes intense. "You don't need to thank me, Alessia. I enjoy our conversations. Your company." It was the closest he'd come to admitting any kind of affection, any kind of connection. And it shook her, more than she cared to admit. But the echoes of lost freedom still haunted her. She yearned for the days when she could wander through the city without a bodyguard, when she could paint without the weight of the Mafia world on her shoulders, when she could dream of a future that wasn't dictated by a forced marriage and a blood feud. One afternoon, she decided to escape. She slipped out of the palazzo, leaving a note for Maria, telling her she was going for a walk in the city. She knew it was risky, that Marcello wouldn't approve, but she needed to feel the sun on her skin, to breathe the air of freedom, even if only for a few hours. She wandered through the familiar streets of her childhood, the sights and sounds of the city washing over her, a balm to her wounded soul. She visited her favorite cafe, where she used to spend hours sketching the people passing by. She walked along the river, watching the boats glide across the water, their reflections shimmering in the sunlight. She felt alive again, for the first time in weeks. She felt like Alessia, the artist, the dreamer, not Alessia DeSantis Ricci, the Mafia wife, the prisoner. But the illusion of freedom was shattered when she saw them. Two men, following her, their faces familiar, their eyes watchful.
Marcello's men.
She knew she couldn't outrun them. She knew she couldn't escape. She was still trapped, still under his control. She turned and walked back towards the palazzo, her heart heavy with disappointment, with the crushing weight of her reality. When she returned, Marcello was waiting for her in the foyer, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. She met his gaze, her own defiant. "I went for a walk." "Without an escort? Without telling me?" "I needed some air," she replied, her voice steady. "I needed to be myself. For a few hours." He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "You are my wife, Alessia. You don't have the luxury of being yourself. You are a Ricci,
And you will behave accordingly."
She flinched, but didn't back down. "I am not your property, Marcello. I am a human being, and I need freedom." He grabbed her arm, his grip tight, almost painful. "Freedom? You have no idea what freedom is. You've lived a sheltered life, Alessia. You don't know the dangers that lurk in this world. I protect you. I keep you safe." "Safe?" she retorted, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Safe in a gilded cage? Safe from the world, from life, from myself?" He released her arm, his expression softening slightly. "I do what I must, Alessia. To protect you. To protect the family." "And at what cost?" she asked, her question a whispered cry, a haunting feeling that tonight would be the breaking point. She couldn't keep living like this. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The tension between Alessia and Marcello escalated after her attempted escape. He tightened his control, restricting her movements, increasing the surveillance. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, her every move watched, her every word scrutinized. The studio, once her sanctuary, now felt like another cage. She found it harder to paint, the joy of creation replaced by a suffocating sense of confinement. The canvases remained blank, or filled with angry, frustrated strokes that reflected her inner turmoil. Their evenings, once a tentative truce, became strained and silent. They ate dinner at opposite ends of the long table, the vast space between them a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The conversations, once hesitant but revealing, ceased altogether. One night, Alessia couldn't take it anymore. She pushed her plate away, the food untouched. "I can't live like this, Marcello," she said, her voice shaking.
I'm suffocating.
He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Like what, Alessia?" "Like this. Like a prisoner. Like a possession." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on hers. "You are my wife. That comes with certain obligations." "Obligations? Or restrictions? You control everything I do, everyone I see. I have no freedom, no autonomy." "I protect you," he said, his voice firm. "This world is dangerous, Alessia. You wouldn't survive without me." "I'd rather risk death than live like this," she retorted, her voice rising. "I'd rather be free, even if it means facing danger, than be trapped in this gilded cage." He stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, his presence menacing. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what's out there." She met his gaze, her own defiant. "Then show me. Let me see the world you're so afraid of. Let me understand the dangers. Let me be a part of your life, not just a possession in your house." He stopped in front of her, his body close, his eyes searching hers. "And if I do, what then? Then maybe I'll understand. Maybe I'll accept. Maybe we can find a way to coexist. Not as prisoner and jailer, but as partners." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities.
Partnership.
It was a radical idea, a dangerous proposition in their world. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both possessive and tender. She shivered, but didn't pull away. "You ask for much, Alessia," he whispered. "You challenge me at every turn. You intrigue me." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "Very well. I'll show you. I'll show you the world I inhabit. But be warned, Alessia. It's not pretty. It's not safe."
And it will change you.
She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was taking a risk, a gamble that could cost her everything. But she had to try. She had to find a way to break free from the gilded cage, to find a way to live, to breathe, to be herself. The next day, he took her with him. Not to the docks, not to the heart of the Ricci Empire, but to a small, unassuming restaurant in a quiet neighborhood. "This is where it all started," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy. He'd meet with his associates. He'd teach me the business." She looked around the restaurant, its simple decor, its ordinary clientele. It seemed so normal, so far removed from the opulent world of the Palazzo Ricci. "It doesn't look like much," she said. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. "Appearances can be deceiving, Alessia. This place had holds secrets. It's seen deals made, lives ruined, fortunes won and lost." He introduced her to the owner, an older man with a weathered face and knowing eyes. The man greeted Marcello with respect, with a hint of fear. He treated Alessia with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They sat at a corner table, and Marcello ordered a simple meal of pasta and wine. He began to talk, not about business, not about the details of his operations, but about the people, the families, the intricate web of relationships that made up the Mafia world. He told her stories, some funny, some tragic, some brutal. He spoke of loyalty and betrayal, of love and hate, of the constant struggle for power and survival. She listened, fascinated, horrified, and strangely drawn in. She began to understand the complexities of his world, the pressures he faced, the choices he had to make. He showed her his scars, not the physical ones, but the emotional ones. The wounds inflicted by a demanding father, a violent upbringing, a life lived in the shadows. She, in turn, showed him hers. The pain of her father's death, the betrayal of her forced marriage, the loss of her freedom, her dreams. They were two damaged souls, scarred by their pasts, trapped in a world not of their own making. But in that small, unassuming restaurant, Surrounded by the echoes of past deals and broken lives, they found a connection, a shared understanding, a flicker of hope for something more. For the first time, Marcello asked her to dance. And for the first time, Alessia said yes.
It was a small step.
But she could only pray it was in the right direction. Chapter 8. The Price of Protection. The dance was a turning point. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden declaration of love, but a subtle change in the dynamic between Alessia and Marcello. He began to include her more in his life, taking her to meetings, introducing her to his associates, sharing the details of his business, the good, bad, and the ugly. She, in turn, began to understand the complexities of his world, the constant pressure, the ever-present threat of violence, the delicate balance of power that he had to maintain. She saw the ruthlessness, the cold-blooded calculations, but she also saw the loyalty he inspired, the respect he commanded, the genuine care he showed for the people who depended on him. She started to see him not just as her captor, not just as the man who had killed her father, but as a human being, flawed and damaged, but also capable of kindness, of compassion, of a strange, twisted kind of honor. She still hated the world he inhabited, the violence, the betrayal, the constant fear. But she began to understand his place in it, his role as the protector, the enforcer, the leader. One evening, he took her to the docks, the heart of the Ricci Empire, the place where her father had died. It was a sprawling complex of warehouses, cranes, and ships, a hive of activity, even in the dead of night. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and diesel fuel, the sounds of machinery and shouting men. She felt a chill run down her spine, a wave of grief and anger wash over her. This was where her old life had ended, where her new life had begun. Marcello sensed her unease. He placed a hand on her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I know this is difficult for you," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "This is where he died," she whispered. He nodded, his expression somber. "I know." He didn't offer excuses, didn't try to justify his actions. He simply stood there, his presence a silent support, a shield against the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. He led her through the warehouses, showing her the operations, explaining the intricacies of the business. He introduced her to the workers, the men who loaded and unloaded the ships, the foremen who oversaw the operations, the guards who protected the perimeter. They treated her with respect, with a hint of awe. She was the wife of their boss, the woman who held his ear, his trust. She was a symbol of his power, but also, perhaps, a potential influence, a voice for change. She saw the fear in their eyes, the fear of the Riccis, of Marcello, of the violence that was always lurking beneath the surface. But she also saw the loyalty, the respect, the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. As they walked back towards the car, Marcello stopped, his gaze fixed on a darkened corner of the warehouse. "This is where it happened," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is where your father died." She followed his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She could almost see the scene, the flashing lights, the police cars, the body on the ground. She felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards Marcello, towards the Riccis, towards the world that had taken her father from her. But she also felt something else, a strange, unsettling sense of understanding. She saw the necessity of his actions, the brutal logic of the Mafia world. He had done what he had to do to protect his family, his empire, his own life. It didn't excuse his actions, didn't erase the pain, the loss. But it offered a different perspective, a glimpse into the twisted morality of their world. "Why did you do it, Marcello?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you kill him?" He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He wouldn't yield, Alessia. He wouldn't compromise. He was a threat. To me. To my family. To everything. "And was it worth it?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "Was it worth the blood, the pain, the loss?" He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. She knew the answer. In his world, it was power was the ultimate prize, and violence was the price of protection. As they drove back to the palazzo, she realized something profound. She was beginning to understand Marcello, to see the world through his eyes. But she was also losing a part of herself, the innocent, idealistic part that believed in justice, in fairness, in a world without violence. She was becoming a Ricci, not just in name, but in spirit. And she wasn't sure if she could live with that. She knew, deep down, she and Marcello were playing with fire. The peace between them, the shared understanding, was built on very dangerous grounds. And any minute now, everything could fall apart. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Rebellion. The realization that she was becoming a part of Marcello's world, that she was starting to think and act like a Ricci, sparked a flicker of rebellion within Alessia. She couldn't completely abandon the values she'd grown up with, the belief in justice, in compassion, in a life beyond the confines of the Mafia. She started small, subtle acts of defiance, ways of asserting her own identity, of pushing back against the suffocating control of the Ricci world. She began to use her influence, her position as Marcello's wife, to help the people around her, the servants, the workers, the families who depended on the Ricci empire. She listened to their concerns, their grievances, their fears. She learned about their lives, their struggles, their hopes. She saw the poverty, the injustice, the exploitation that existed beneath the glittering surface of the Mafia world. She started by intervening on behalf of the servants at the palazzo, securing better working conditions, higher wages, more time off. She used her own money, the remnants of her DeSantis inheritance, to help families in need, to pay for medical bills, to send children to school. She did it quietly, discreetly, without Marcello's knowledge. She knew he wouldn't approve, that he'd see it as a weakness, a betrayal of the Ricci code. But she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had to find a way to make a difference, to bring some light into the darkness of their world. She also started to use her art as a form of rebellion. She began to paint again, not the landscapes and cityscapes that Marcello admired, but portraits of the people she met, the servants, the workers, the families who lived in the shadows of the Ricci empire. She captured their faces, their expressions, their stories. She painted their pain, their resilience, their humanity. She gave them a voice, a visibility, that they had been denied. She didn't show these paintings to Marcello. She kept them hidden in a locked room in the studio, a secret gallery of her rebellion. One day, Maria, the older servant who had warned her about Marcello, came to her with a request. Her son, Marco, had been arrested, falsely accused of stealing from one of the Ricci businesses. He was facing a long prison sentence, a sentence that would ruin his life. Maria begged Alessia to intervene, to use her influence with Marcello to secure Marco's release. She knew it was a risk, that Marcello wouldn't be pleased, but she was desperate. Alessia hesitated. She knew the dangers of crossing Marcello, of interfering in his business. But she couldn't turn a blind eye to Maria's plea. She couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man suffer.
She decided to take the risk.
She waited until Marcello returned from a late-night meeting, his face tired, his eyes shadowed. She knew he was in a vulnerable state, that he might be more receptive to her request. She approached him in his study, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marcello, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady. He looked up at her, his expression guarded. "What is it, Alessia?" She told him about Marco, about Maria's plea, about the injustice of the situation. She spoke with passion, with conviction, appealing to his sense of fairness, of honor. He listened, his face impassive, his eyes unreadable. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You're interfering in my business, Alessia," he said. "You're crossing a line." She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I'm asking for justice, Marcello," she replied. "For fairness. For compassion." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked towards her, his presence menacing. "Compassion?"
He scoffed.
"There's no room for compassion in this world, Alessia. Only strength. Only power. There has to be," she insisted, her voice shaking but firm. There has to be room for humanity, for kindness. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. You're naive, Alessia, he said, his voice softer now. You still believe in fairy tales. In happy endings. I believe in making a difference, she replied. In trying to make things better. Even in this world. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and tender. She shivered, but didn't pull away. You're changing, Alessia, he whispered. You're becoming dangerous. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. But I find myself admiring your courage. Your defiance. He pulled back, his eyes still locked with hers. Very well, he said, his voice firm. I'll look into it. I'll see what I can do. She felt a wave of relief, of gratitude, wash over her. She had taken a risk, and it had paid off. She had challenged Marcelo, and he had yielded. At least, for now. She had taken the first step in changing things within. But now, she had to prepare for the consequences. Chapter 10. Unspoken Truths Unveiled. Marcelo kept his word. He investigated the case of Maria's son, Marco, and discovered that the accusations were indeed false. The young man had been framed by a rival faction within the Ricci organization, a group seeking to undermine Marcelo's authority and seize control of his territory. Marcelo dealt with the situation swiftly and brutally. He exposed the plot, punished the perpetrators, and secured Marco's release. He didn't do it out of compassion, he told Alessia, but out of necessity. He couldn't allow dissent within his ranks, couldn't tolerate challenges to his power. But Alessia saw a different side of him in the way he handled the situation. She saw a sense of justice, however twisted, a desire to protect the innocent, even if it was motivated by self-preservation. The incident with Marco deepened the connection between Alessia and Marcelo, creating a fragile bond of trust and understanding. He began to confide in her more, sharing the details of his business, the challenges he faced, the threats he had to neutralize. She, in turn, continued to use her influence to help the people around her, advocating for better working conditions, fairer treatment, and access to education and healthcare. She became a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the marginalized, a force for change within the Ricci Empire. Marcelo tolerated her actions, sometimes even supporting them, as long as they didn't directly challenge his authority or threaten his power. He saw the benefits of her influence, the way she calmed tensions, fostered loyalty, and improved the image of the Ricci family. He still didn't trust her completely. He knew she was playing a dangerous game, that her actions could have unintended consequences, that she could become a target for his enemies. One evening, as they were sitting in the library, surrounded by the silent company of ancient books, he confronted her. You're walking a tightrope, Alessia, he said, his voice low and serious. You're pushing the boundaries. You're taking risks. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. I'm doing what I believe is right, Marcelo, she replied. I'm trying to make a difference. And what if you fail? He asked. What if your actions lead to consequences? What if you become a target? Then I'll face the consequences, she said, her voice firm. I'm not afraid. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. You should be, he whispered. This world is unforgiving, Alessia. It devours the weak, the naive, the compassionate. Then I'll be strong, she replied. I'll be resilient. I'll survive. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. And what about us, Alessia? He asked. What about this connection we have? This fragile truce? She felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew he was asking about more than just their working relationship. He was asking about their feelings, their unspoken desires, the dangerous attraction that simmered between them. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know the answer herself. She was drawn to him, fascinated by him, even cared for him, in a strange, twisted way. But she also hated what he represented, the violence, the cruelty, the world he inhabited. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. There are things you don't know, Alessia, he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. Things about my past. Things about my father. Things about your father. She felt a chill run down her spine. She knew he was talking about the circumstances surrounding her father's death, the secrets that had been buried, the truths that had been concealed. "Tell me," she whispered.
"Tell me everything."
He hesitated, his expression conflicted. He was torn between his loyalty to his family, his code of silence, and his growing affection for Alessia. "It's not a simple story," he said. "It's complicated. And dangerous." "I need to know, Marcello," she insisted. "I need to understand. I need the truth." He took a deep breath, then began to speak. He told her about the long-standing feud between the Ricci and DeSantis families, the decades of violence and betrayal, the constant struggle for power and control. He told her about his father, a ruthless, ambitious man who had been obsessed with destroying the DeSantis family, with seizing their territory, with eliminating their influence. He told her about her father, a proud, stubborn man who had refused to yield, who had fought to protect his family, his legacy, his honor. And then, he told her the truth about her father's death. It wasn't a simple act of aggression, a message sent by the Riccis. It was something more complicated, more personal. Marcello confessed he had a secret meeting with her father. And in that meeting, Antonio had begged Marcello to protect Alessia at all costs, even if it meant marrying her. Antonio revealed a dark secret, a secret that would change everything. Chapter 11. The Lion and the Lamb. Marcello's revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a shroud draped over Alessia's world. Antonio DeSantis, her strong, seemingly invincible father, had begged Marcello Ricci, his sworn enemy, to protect her. The image shattered the carefully constructed narrative of her life, the black and white morality she'd clung to in the turbulent sea of the Mafia world. "He begged you?" Alessia whispered, her voice trembling, her mind struggling to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew. Marcello nodded, his green eyes, usually so sharp and guarded, now clouded with a mixture of regret, and was it guilt? He knew he was a marked man, Alessia. Not just by the Riccis, but by others. He'd made too many enemies, crossed too many lines. Others? Alessia pressed, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Who else?
"What aren't you telling me?"
Marcello hesitated, the silence stretching, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, as if seeking answers in their fiery depths. "Your father, he wasn't always the man you knew," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "He made mistakes, Alessia. Big mistakes. He got involved with dangerous people. People outside the usual circles." "What kind of people?" Alessia demanded, her voice rising. She needed to know, needed to understand the shadows that had haunted her father's life, the secrets that had ultimately led to his death. Marcello took a deep breath, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with a gravity she'd never seen before. "He owed a debt, Alessia. A large debt. Not just money, but favors. To a group more powerful, more ruthless than any of the families here. A group that operates outside the law, outside the code." "Who?" Alessia asked, her voice barely a whisper, a terrifying premonition taking root in her heart. "The Syndicate," Marcello said, the word itself a chilling whisper, a name that evoked fear and dread even in the hardened hearts of the Mafia world. "They're everywhere, Alessia. And nowhere. They control everything. And nothing. They're the shadow government, the puppet masters, the real power. The Syndicate." Alessia had heard whispers of them, rumors of their vast reach, their ruthless efficiency, their absolute control. They were a legend, a myth, a boogeyman used to scare children and silence dissent. But she'd never believed they were real. Until now. "My father was involved with them?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcello nodded. "He borrowed money, Alessia. A lot of money. To expand his operations, to fight off the Riccis, to maintain his power. But the debt it grew. And the interest, it was more than just money. It was obedience.
Complicity."
"And he couldn't pay?" Alessia asked, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, forming a horrifying picture. "He tried," Marcello said. He tried everything. But they wanted more than just money. They wanted control. They wanted to use him, to use the DeSantis family, to infiltrate the city, to expand their operations. And he refused? Alessia asked, a glimmer of pride flickering through the darkness of her despair. He resisted, Marcello corrected. He tried to find a way out. He came to me. He knew I was the only one who could protect you. From them. From everyone. So, the marriage, it wasn't just about the docs, about the Ricci power? Alessia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and a growing, unsettling sense of hope. Marcello shook his head. It was a shield, Alessia. A way to keep you safe. To keep you out of their reach. To honor your father's last wish. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, a touch that was both tender and protective. I didn't want to marry you, Alessia, he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. Not like that. Not under those circumstances. But I had no choice. I had to protect you. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the truth in his gaze, the sincerity, the burden he carried. He hadn't been the villain she'd imagined, the ruthless predator who had stolen her life. He had been a reluctant protector, a pawn in a larger game, a man trapped by his own code, his own sense of obligation. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, her voice soft. He shrugged, his expression conflicted. I didn't want to burden you with it. I didn't want to scare you. And I didn't want to betray your father's trust.
But now? She asked.
Why tell me now? He met her gaze, his eyes intense. Because you deserve to know the truth, Alessia. Because you're strong enough to handle it. And because he hesitated. The words caught in his throat.
He couldn't say it.
He couldn't admit the feelings that had grown, the unexpected affection, the love that had blossomed in the darkness of their forced marriage. She reached out, her hand covering his, her fingers intertwining with his. Because you what, Marcello? She prompted, her voice gentle. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb caressing her skin, a silent acknowledgement of the connection between them. Because I care about you, Alessia, he finally confessed, the words barely a whisper. More than I should. More than I ever thought possible. It was a confession of vulnerability, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. And it changed everything. The lion had admitted his feelings for the lamb. But even as relief washed over Alessia, the words revealed what was to come. They were in even greater danger than before. And now they had to face the syndicate, together. Chapter 12. A pact forged in darkness. The revelation of Marcello's feelings, coupled with a terrifying truth about the syndicate's involvement in her father's death, forged a new bond between Alessia and Marcello. It wasn't love, not yet, not fully. But it was a deep connection, a shared understanding, a mutual respect born of shared danger and a growing, undeniable affection. They spend the next few days in a state of heightened alert, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the syndicate. Marcello tightened security at the palazzo, increased the patrols around their territory, and reached out to his allies, strengthening his network of informants and enforcers. Alessia, despite her fear, refused to be a passive victim. She insisted on being involved in the preparations, learning about the syndicate's operations, their methods, their weaknesses. She used her intelligence, her intuition, her knowledge of the city's underbelly to help Marcello devise a strategy, a plan to protect themselves and their empire. She also continued her own quiet acts of rebellion, using her influence to help the people caught in the crossfire of the Mafia world, providing aid to the families displaced by violence, supporting the victims of exploitation, offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness. One evening, as they were working late in the library, poring over maps and reports, Marcello looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're remarkable, Alessia, he said, his voice soft. You're strong, resourceful, and compassionate. You're everything I'm not. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. And you're everything I thought I hated, she replied, her voice equally soft. Ruthless, cold-blooded, and powerful. But you're also loyal, protective, and surprisingly kind. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "We're a strange pair, aren't we?"
he said.
"The lion and the lamb." "The lion and the lioness," she corrected, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I'm not a lamb anymore, Marcelo. I've learned to roar." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Indeed you have," he said. "And I find myself captivated by your roar." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, a touch that was both tender and passionate. She leaned into his touch, her heart beating faster, her body responding to his proximity. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative kiss, a question, a promise. She responded, her lips parting, her body melting into his, the kiss deepening, becoming more urgent, more demanding. It was a moment of surrender, of vulnerability, of a shared desire that had been simmering beneath the surface of their forced marriage. It was a moment of truth, of recognition, of the undeniable connection that had grown between them. But it was also a moment of danger, of recklessness, of defying the unspoken rules of their world. They were playing with fire, and they knew it. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding. They knew they couldn't deny their feelings any longer, but they also knew the risks, the consequences, the potential for heartbreak and betrayal. "We need to be careful, Alessia," Marcelo said, his voice husky with emotion. "This changes everything." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to be careful anymore. I want to be with you. Fully. Without reservations. Without fear." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he could protect her from the world, from the danger, from himself. "I want that too, Alessia," he whispered. "But we have to be smart. We have to be strategic. The syndicate, they're not like the other families. They're ruthless. They'll stop at nothing." They made a pact that night, a vow forged in darkness, a promise to face the syndicate together, to protect each other, to fight for their future, for their love, for their freedom. They knew the odds were stacked against them, that they were facing an enemy more powerful, more dangerous than any they had ever encountered. But they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that, they believed, was enough. At least, they hoped it was. The next morning, they received a message, an anonymous note, delivered to the palazzo, bearing a single word, tomorrow. It was a threat, a challenge, a declaration of war. The syndicate was coming. Chapter 13. Cracks in the Foundation. The anonymous note, with its stark, single-word threat tomorrow, sent a chill through the Palazzo Ricci. It was a clear indication that the syndicate was aware of their preparations, of their defiance, of their alliance. It was a reminder of their power, their reach, their ability to strike at any moment, from any direction. Marcelo immediately mobilized his forces, putting the palazzo on lockdown, increasing security patrols, and reaching out to his allies for support. He knew that this was not a battle they could win with brute force alone. The syndicate was too vast, too powerful, too deeply embedded in the fabric of the city's power structure. They needed a different strategy, a way to outsmart their enemy, to exploit their weaknesses, to strike at the heart of their operations. Alessia, despite her fear, remained calm and focused. She used her knowledge of the city, her connections with the people, her understanding of the syndicate's methods to help Marcelo devise a plan. She suggested they target the syndicate's financial network, their money laundering operations, their sources of illicit income. She knew that hitting them where it hurt their wallets would be more effective than any direct confrontation. Marcelo, initially hesitant to involve Alessia so directly in the dangerous game, eventually relented, recognizing the value of her insights, her intelligence, her courage. He saw that she was not just his wife, not just a pawn in his world, but a partner, an ally, a force to be reckoned with. They worked together, day and night, poring over maps, financial records, intelligence reports, piecing together the intricate puzzle of the syndicate's operations. They identified key figures, front companies, corrupt officials, and hidden assets. They planned a series of coordinated strikes, designed to disrupt the syndicate's financial network, to cripple their operations, to send a message that the Ricci's were not to be trifled with. But as they delved deeper into the syndicate's web, they began to uncover cracks in their own foundation, fissures in their own alliance. They discovered that some of Marcello's closest associates, trusted lieutenants, were secretly working for the syndicate, feeding them information, undermining their efforts, betraying their trust. The revelation shook Marcello to his core. He had always prided himself on loyalty, on the strength of his family, on the unwavering support of his men. But now he realized that he had been blind, that he had underestimated the reach of the syndicate, their ability to corrupt, to infiltrate, to destroy. One evening, as they were sitting in the library, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal, Marcello slammed his fist on the table, his face a mask of anger and frustration. "I trusted them, Alessia," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I gave them everything. And they stabbed me in the back." Alessia placed a comforting hand on his arm, her touch a silent reassurance. "I know, Marcello," she said, her voice soft. "It's devastating. But we can't let it break us. We have to adapt. We have to fight back." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude.
"You're right," he said.
"We can't give up. We have to purge the ranks. We have to eliminate the traitors." He knew what he had to do. It was a brutal, bloody task, but it was necessary. He had to cleanse his organization, to root out the corruption, to restore the loyalty and trust that had been shattered. He called a meeting of his remaining loyal lieutenants, the men he still trusted, the men who had proven their allegiance. He laid out the evidence of betrayal, the names of the traitors, the details of their treachery. He ordered them to act swiftly and decisively, to eliminate the traitors, to send a message to the syndicate, to show them that the Ricci's were still a force to be reckoned with. It was a night of bloodshed, of violence, of reckoning. The streets of the city ran red with the blood of the traitors, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of the Mafia world. Alessia, despite her aversion to violence, understood the necessity of Marcello's actions. She knew that he had to protect his family, his empire, his honor. But she also saw the toll it took on him, the darkness that crept into his eyes, the weight of the responsibility he carried. She held him close that night, offering him comfort, solace, a silent promise of support. She knew that they were walking a dangerous path, that they were risking everything, but she also knew that they had no choice. They had to fight for their survival, for their future, for their love. But as the traitors were taken down, one name was missing. One traitor seemed to have escaped. And Alessia feared that this person, the one pulling the strings in Marcello's organization, may have been the one who had orchestrated Antonio's death. Chapter 14. The Scent of Betrayal. The purge of the traitors within the Ricci organization had been swift and brutal, a necessary act of self-preservation in the ruthless world of the Mafia. But the escape of one key figure, a man named Sal DeMarco, cast a long shadow over their victory. DeMarco had been Marcello's most trusted advisor, his right-hand man, a figure who had been with the family for decades. He was also Alessia's uncle. The revelation that Sal was a traitor, that he had been working for the syndicate, struck Alessia like a physical blow. She had always trusted him, confided in him, seen him as a father figure after her own father's death. The betrayal cut deep, shattering her illusions, leaving her with a profound sense of loss and disillusionment. Marcello, despite his own shock and anger, tried to comfort her. He knew how close she had been to Sal, how much this betrayal would hurt her. "I'm sorry, Alessia," he said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I know this is difficult for you." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "He was family, Marcello," she whispered. "I trusted him." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "I know," he said, "and I understand. But he chose his path, Alessia. He chose to betray us. He chose to side with the syndicate."
"But why?"
she asked, her voice filled with anguish. Why would he do this? What did they offer him? Marcello hesitated, his expression conflicted. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to hurt her further. Power, Alessia, he finally said, his voice low and strained. They offered him power. A chance to take over. To replace me. Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that Sal was ambitious, that he had resented Marcello's position, that he had coveted the leadership of the Ricci family. But she had never imagined he would go so far, that he would betray his own blood, his own family. The reveal that her own uncle had ordered the hit on her father gutted her. He ordered the hit on my father? Alessia choked out. Marcello tightened his hold on her and softly spoke.
Yes.
I am so sorry. Alessia began to sob, great heaving sounds that racked her body. Marcello, realizing what needed to be done, left Alessia to grieve and began the hunt for Sal DeMarco, scouring the city, using his network of informants, calling in favors, pulling every string he could. He was determined to find him, to bring him to justice, to make him pay for his betrayal. But Sal was elusive, a ghost in a machine, a master of disguise and deception. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the scent of betrayal, the bitter taste of shattered trust. Alessia, despite her grief and anger, refused to be a passive victim. She used her own connections, her own knowledge of Sal's habits, his contacts, his hideouts, to help Marcello in the hunt. She knew that she was the key to finding him, that she held the pieces of the puzzle that could lead them to him. She remembered a conversation she had had with Sal months before her father's death, a seemingly innocuous conversation about a secluded villa he owned in the countryside, a place where he went to escape the pressures of the city, to relax, to think. She shared this information with Marcello, suggesting that Sal might be hiding there, using it as a base of operations, a refuge from the storm. Marcello, initially skeptical, eventually agreed to investigate. He dispatched a team of his most trusted men to the villa, ordering them to proceed with caution, to avoid alerting Sal, to capture him alive if possible. He wanted to question him, to understand his motives, to uncover the full extent of his treachery. He wanted to make him pay for his betrayal, not just with his life, but with the truth. Alessia waited at the palazzo, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She prayed that they would find Sal, that they would bring him to justice, that they would finally uncover the truth about her father's death, about the syndicate's involvement, about the web of deceit that had ensnared her family. She knew that the confrontation with Sal would be painful, devastating, but she also knew that it was necessary. She had to face him, to confront him, to exorcise the demons that haunted her. She had to find a way to move forward, to rebuild her life, to find peace. But first she had to find Sal. And she had to prepare for the final confrontation, the one that would change everything. The waiting was agonizing, but she would find out one way or another if her hunch was right. Chapter 15. Threads of Deception. The wait stretched on, each hour an eternity, filled with a gnawing anxiety that ate away at Alessia's resolve. She paced the confines of the palazzo, her footsteps echoing in the silent halls, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 fears. She imagined Sal, hiding in the secluded villa, plotting his next move, his betrayal a festering wound in her heart. Marcello had remained stoic, his emotions carefully masked, but Alessia saw the tension in his jaw, the darkness in his eyes, the barely suppressed rage that simmered beneath his calm exterior. He was a predator on the hunt, his prey a man he had once trusted, a man who had betrayed him, a man who had hurt the woman he loved. As night fell, casting long shadows across the city, a message arrived. It was from the leader of the team Marcello had dispatched to the villa. Sal DeMarco had been found, but he wasn't alone. The message was terse, cryptic, offering few details. It spoke of a meeting, of other figures present, of a deal being struck. It hinted at a larger conspiracy, a deeper betrayal, a web of deceit that extended beyond Sal, beyond the Ricci family, beyond even the syndicate. Marcello, his face a mask of grim determination, ordered Alessia to remain at the palazzo, under heavy guard. He knew that this was a dangerous situation, that Sal was not just a rogue agent, but a pawn in a larger game, a game with players they didn't yet understand. Alessia, however, refused to be left behind. She insisted on accompanying Marcello, on facing Sal, on confronting the truth, no matter how painful, how dangerous. "I need to be there, Marcello," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely resolve.
"He's my uncle."
"I know him. I need to understand." Marcello hesitated, his concern for her safety warring with his respect for her strength, her determination. He knew that she wouldn't be deterred, that she would follow him, regardless of his orders. All right, he finally relented, his voice heavy with resignation. "But you stay close to me. You do as I say. And you don't engage. Understood?" She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by, that she had to be a part of this, that she had to face her demons head-on. They set off in a convoy of armored cars, a silent procession of steel and firepower, heading towards the secluded villa, towards the inevitable confrontation. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of colors and shadows, reflecting the turmoil in Alessia's soul. As they approached the villa, they saw it. A flickering light in the distance, a sign of activity, of the meeting taking place, of the deal being struck. Marcello ordered the cars to stop a short distance away, instructing his men to surround the villa, to cut off any escape routes, to prepare for a fight. He turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and affection. "Stay close," he repeated, his voice low and urgent. "And be careful." She nodded, her hand reaching for his, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent promise of support, of unity, of love. They approached the villa on foot, stealthily, silently, like predators stalking their prey. The air was thick with tension, with the scent of danger, with the unspoken threat of violence. As they neared the main entrance, they heard voices, muffled by the thick walls, but audible nonetheless. They recognized Sal's voice, smooth and persuasive, and another voice, unfamiliar, but authoritative, commanding. Marcello signaled his men, and they breached the door, bursting into the villa, weapons drawn, ready for a fight. The scene that greeted them was not what they expected. Sal was there, standing in the center of the room, but he wasn't negotiating a deal. He was pleading. He was on his knees, his hands bound, his face bruised and bloodied. And standing over him was a figure Alessia didn't recognize, a tall, imposing man with cold, cruel eyes and a sinister smile. The man was holding a gun, pointed at Sal's head. And as Marcello and Alessia entered the room, he turned towards them, his smile widening, his eyes gleaming with a malicious triumph. "Welcome, Marcello," the man said, his voice smooth and menacing. "And the lovely Alessia. I've been expecting you." He gestured towards Sal, his gun still trained on his head. "It seems your trusted advisor has been playing both sides. He thought he could betray me, betray the syndicate, and get away with it." Sal looked at Alessia, eyes wide. "Alessia," the words hung in the air. A desperate plea, a final confession, a moment of truth shattered by the sudden, deafening report of a gunshot. The bullet that was meant for her uncle was now lodged in Marcello's chest. Chapter 16. A desperate plea. The gunshot echoed through the villa, a sharp, brutal sound that shattered the tense silence. Alessia screamed, a primal cry of anguish and terror, as Marcello stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest, a crimson stain blooming on his white shirt. The unknown assailant, his face a mask of cold indifference, lowered his gun, his eyes fixed on Alessia. "A pity," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I was hoping to have a little chat with you, Signora Ricci. But it seems your husband has interfered." Alessia didn't hear him. She rushed to Marcello's side, dropping to her knees, her hands frantically pressing against his wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Marcello!" she cried, her voice choked with sobs.
"Hold on."
"Please hold on." He looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a strange, unsettling calm. "Alessia," he whispered, his voice weak, his breath ragged. Run, get out of here, no, she cried. I won't leave you. I won't. She looked around, desperately, at Marcello's men, who stood frozen, stunned by the sudden turn of events, unsure how to react, their loyalty divided between their fallen leader and the unknown assailant.
Help him.
She screamed, her voice cracking with desperation.
Do something.
But the men hesitated, their eyes darting between Alessia and the assailant, who still stood there, his gun now trained on her, a smirk playing on his lips. I wouldn't advise that, the assailant said, his voice smooth and menacing. Unless you want to join your husband in the afterlife. He gestured toward Sal, who lay slumped on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, his life extinguished by the single, brutal shot. As you can see, the assailant continued, I don't tolerate betrayal. And I certainly don't tolerate interference. Alessia felt a surge of rage, of defiance, rising within her. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't beg, wouldn't show fear. She would fight. For Marcello. For herself. For their love. She looked up at the assailant, her eyes blazing with anger.
Who are you?
She demanded, her voice trembling but firm. What do you want? The man smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. My name is of no consequence, Signora Ricci, he said. But my organization is. I represent the syndicate. And we want what is rightfully ours.
What is that?
Alessia asked, her mind racing, trying to understand his motives, his goals, his plan. Control, the man said, his voice simple and direct. Control of your city, control of your operations, control of you. He stepped closer, his gun still trained on her, his eyes boring into hers. Your husband was a nuisance, he said. A thorn in our side. But you, Signora Ricci, you are an asset. A valuable asset. And we intend to utilize you. Alessia felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She understood now. The syndicate didn't just want to eliminate Marcello, to seize control of his empire. They wanted to use her, to control her, to make her their puppet, their queen. I will never be your puppet, she said, her voice filled with defiance. I will never betray Marcello. I will never submit. The man chuckled, a low, throaty sound that echoed in the silence. You have no choice, Signora Ricci, he said. Your husband is dying. Your uncle is dead. And your allies are unreliable. He gestured towards Marcello's men, who still stood there, frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They know who holds the power now, the assailant said. They know that their loyalty lies with the syndicate. Alessia felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped, surrounded by enemies, with no hope of escape, no chance of survival. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She looked down at Marcello, his face growing paler, his breathing shallower, his life slipping away. She knew she had to do something, anything, to save him, to buy him time, to defy the syndicate. She made a desperate plea, a gamble, a last-ditch effort to change the course of events, to save the man she loved. Please, she said, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face. I'll do anything. I'll cooperate. I'll give you what you want. Just help him. Please save him. The assailant's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation. He saw an opportunity, a chance to exploit her vulnerability, to use her desperation to his advantage. Anything? He asked, his voice smooth and seductive. Are you sure, Signora Ricci? She nodded, her head bobbing frantically. Yes, she whispered. Anything. Very well, the man said, his smile returning. Then here's what we'll do. He outlined his plan, his demands, his terms. It was a dangerous gamble, a risky proposition, but it was the only chance she had. The only chance to save Marcello. The only chance to fight back. She only had moments left, and she could only pray that her plea had worked. Chapter 17. Reckoning in the Ruins. The assailant's plan was audacious, a desperate gamble that played on Alessia's love for Marcello and her willingness to do anything to save his life. He ordered his men to arrange for immediate medical attention for Marcello, not at a hospital, where they would be vulnerable to police intervention and rival factions, but at a clandestine clinic, a hidden facility used by the syndicate for their own illicit needs. Alessia was to accompany Marcello, under guard, ensuring her cooperation and preventing any attempts at escape or resistance. In return, the assailant promised to spare Marcello's life, to provide him with the best possible care, to keep him alive. It was a devil's bargain, a pact made with the enemy, but Alessia saw no other choice. She had to trust that the assailant would honor his word, that he would see the value in keeping Marcello alive, in using him as leverage, as a bargaining chip in their twisted game. As Marcello was being carried out of the villa, his body limp and bleeding, his eyes flickering open, meeting Alessia's, conveying a mixture of pain, apology, and love. She gave him a reassuring smile, a silent promise to fight for him, to save him, to never give up. The journey to the clinic was a blur, a nightmarish ride through the darkened streets of the city, the siren of the ambulance a mournful wail that echoed Alessia's own despair. She sat beside Marcello, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort, of hope, of love. She prayed for his survival, for his recovery, for a chance to redeem their lives, to escape the clutches of the syndicate, to find a future together. The clinic was a sterile, windowless building, hidden in a nondescript industrial area, a place where secrets were kept, where lives were saved and lost, where the lines between good and evil blurred. The medical staff, a team of silent, efficient professionals, worked tirelessly to stabilize Marcello, to repair the damage, to bring him back from the brink. Alessia waited, pacing the cold, sterile corridors, her heart pounding with fear and anxiety, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 doubts. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, with no one to trust, no one to turn to. But she wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was Alessia DeSantis Ricci, a woman who had learned to fight, to survive, to roar. She used the time to gather information, to observe, to plan. She listened to the conversations of the staff, the guards, the visitors. She learned about the clinic's operations, its connections to the syndicate, its vulnerabilities. She discovered that the clinic was not just a medical facility, but also a hub for the syndicate's illicit activities, a place where they stored weapons, laundered money, and held prisoners. She realized that she was not just a pawn in their game, but a prisoner, a captive, a bargaining chip. But she also realized that she had an opportunity, a chance to strike back, to disrupt their operations, to save Marcello and herself. She began to formulate a plan, a desperate, risky plan that relied on her wits, her courage, and her love for Marcello. She would use her position, her access, her knowledge to turn the tables on the syndicate, to expose their crimes, to bring them down. She knew that she was playing a dangerous game, that she was risking everything, but she also knew that she had no choice. She had to fight. For Marcello. For herself. For their future. As Marcello began to recover, slowly but surely, regaining consciousness, his strength returning, Alessia shared her plan with him, whispering her intentions, her hopes, her fears. He listened, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew the risks, the dangers, but he also knew that she was right. They had to fight back. They had to escape. They worked together, secretly, subtly, using their combined knowledge, their skills, their love to prepare for their escape, to plan their revenge, to reclaim their lives. They knew the day was coming. And she began gathering allies. Alessia's only hope was a doctor. One who was forced to work at the clinic. One who was looking for a way out. One who, with the help of Alessia and Marcello, might actually find redemption. She just had to convince him. She found Dr. Gabinelli, a man with mournful eyes and careful hands. She asked him the question that would change everything. "Do you want out, doctor? I can get you out, but you need to help us." Dr. Gabinelli, after much deliberation, nodded. And finally, they had a way to fight back. It was a desperate gamble, a last, desperate throw of the dice, but it was the only way to free themselves and dismantle the syndicate's operation. Chapter 18. The Unraveling of Secrets. With Dr. Gabinelli's reluctant but crucial assistance, Alessia and Marcello began to weave their intricate plan of escape and revenge. The doctor, weary of his forced servitude to the syndicate, provided them with vital information about the clinic's layout, security protocols, and the routines of the guards and staff. He also agreed to help them communicate with the outside world, smuggling messages to Marcello's remaining loyal lieutenants, the men who had escaped the purge and were now operating in the shadows, awaiting their chance to strike back. Alessia, using her artistic skills and her keen observation, created a detailed map of the clinic, marking the location of surveillance cameras, hidden passages, and potential escape routes. She also identified the key figures within the syndicate's operation, the individuals who controlled the flow of money, weapons, and information. Marcello, despite his weakened condition, used his strategic mind and his knowledge of the syndicate's inner workings to devise a plan to disrupt their operations, to expose their crimes, and to reclaim his power. He focused on targeting their financial network, their sources of illicit income, their connections to corrupt officials and law enforcement agencies. They worked in secret, communicating in whispers, using coded messages, relying on their shared understanding, their trust, their love to guide them through the dangerous labyrinth of their confinement. Dr. Gabinelli, risking his own life, provided them with the tools they needed: a smuggled phone, a set of keys, a vial of sedative, a scalpel. He also offered them medical advice, monitoring Marcello's recovery, ensuring that he would be strong enough to make their escape. As their plan took shape, Alessia discovered a hidden room within the clinic, a secret chamber where the syndicate stored their most sensitive documents, their incriminating evidence, their darkest secrets. She realized that this room was the key to their success, that it held the proof they needed to expose the syndicate's crimes, to bring them down, to clear their names. She shared her discovery with Marcello, and they decided to make the hidden room their primary target. They would retrieve the documents, expose the syndicate's network of corruption, and deliver the evidence to the authorities, ensuring that justice would be served. But as they prepared for their escape, they uncovered a deeper secret, a truth that shook them to their core, a revelation that changed everything. They discovered that the assailant, the man who had shot Marcello and orchestrated their capture, was not just a representative of the syndicate, but someone with a personal vendetta, someone with a connection to their past, someone who had been pulling the strings all along. The man's name was revealed to be Riccardo Balducci, the son of a former Mafia boss who had been defeated and killed by Marcello's father, decades ago. Balducci had spent years plotting his revenge, infiltrating the syndicate, rising through the ranks, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He had used Sal DeMarco as a pawn, manipulating him, exploiting his ambition, turning him against Marcello and Alessia. He had orchestrated her father's death, framing the Riccis, igniting the feud, setting in motion the chain of events that had led to their current predicament. The revelation filled Alessia with a renewed sense of rage, of determination, of purpose. She would not only escape, not only expose the syndicate, but she would also avenge her father, bring Balducci to justice, and end the cycle of violence that had plagued her family for generations. She shared the truth with Marcello, and together, they adjusted their plan, incorporating this new information, focusing their efforts on capturing Balducci, on exposing his crimes, on delivering him to the authorities, or, if necessary, dealing with him themselves. They knew that the final confrontation would be dangerous, deadly, but they were ready. They were prepared to risk everything, to fight for their freedom, for their future, for their love. The night of their escape arrived, a moonless night, shrouded in darkness, a perfect setting for their desperate gamble. Dr. Gabinelli had sedated the guards, disabled the surveillance cameras, and opened the doors. Alessia and Marcello, armed with a scalpel and a smuggled gun, slipped out of their room, their hearts pounding, their senses heightened, their love a shield against the fear. It was time. Time to escape. Time to expose Balducci. And if it was the last thing they did, time to deliver the reckoning that had been so long overdue. Chapter 19. A choice between two worlds. The escape from the clinic was a tense, nerve-wracking affair, a stealthy navigation through the darkened corridors, a silent dance with danger. Alessia and Marcello, guided by Dr. Gabinelli's instructions and Alessia's detailed map, moved like shadows, avoiding the remaining guards, slipping past the deactivated surveillance cameras, their hearts pounding in unison. They reached the hidden room, the vault containing the syndicate's darkest secrets, the evidence that would bring them down. Alessia, using the set of keys provided by Dr. Gabinelli, unlocked the door, revealing a chamber filled with stacks of documents, computer hard drives, and cash. They quickly gathered the most incriminating evidence, focusing on the documents that implicated Riccardo Balducci, the records of his illicit transactions, his connections to corrupt officials, his orders for murder. As they were leaving the room, they heard footsteps, voices approaching. They were discovered. A firefight erupted, a chaotic exchange of gunfire in the confined space. The bullets ricocheting off the walls, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Marcello, despite his recent injury, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, protecting Alessia, covering their retreat. Alessia, armed with a scalpel, proved to be a surprisingly formidable opponent, her movements swift and precise, her strikes deadly. She had learned to fight, to survive, to kill. They managed to escape the room, but the alarm had been raised. The entire clinic was on alert, the guards swarming, searching for them, their footsteps echoing through the corridors. They made their way towards the exit, fighting their way through the waves of attackers, their determination fueled by their love, their courage, their desperation. Dr. Gabinelli, risking his own life, created a diversion, drawing the guards away from their escape route, buying them precious time. He was caught, captured, but he had played his part. He had redeemed himself. He had chosen the right side. Alessia and Marcello reached the exit, bursting out into the cool night air, their lungs filling with the sweet taste of freedom. But their escape was not yet complete. Waiting for them outside was Riccardo Balducci, his face a mask of rage and frustration, his gun trained on Alessia. "You should have stayed put, Signora Ricci," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You should have accepted your fate. You should have cooperated." Alessia met his gaze, her own unwavering, her fear replaced by a cold, hard determination. "I will never cooperate with you, Balducci," she said, her voice steady. "I will never let you in. You have no choice," he sneered. "Your husband is weak. Your allies are scattered. And you are mine." He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes filled with a murderous intent. But before he could fire, Marcello stepped in front of Alessia, shielding her with his body, his own gun drawn, his aim true. "You want her, Balducci?" Marcello said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll have to go through me." The two men faced each other, a standoff between two predators, two rivals, two enemies. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence, with the inevitable reckoning. But before either of them could pull the trigger, a voice rang out, a voice that shattered the stalemate, a voice that changed everything. "Drop your weapons." It was the police, swarming the clinic, their sirens wailing, their lights flashing, their guns drawn. They had been alerted by Dr. Gabinelli, who had managed to send a message before being captured, tipping them off about the syndicate's operation, about the escape, about Balducci. Balducci, realizing that he was cornered, that his plan had failed, that his revenge had been thwarted, hesitated, his eyes darting between Marcello, Alessia, and the approaching police. He had a choice to make. A choice between two worlds. A choice between violence and surrender, between vengeance and justice. He lowered his gun, slowly, reluctantly, his face twisting in a grimace of defeat. He had lost. The police moved in, arresting Balducci, securing the clinic, taking control of the situation. Alessia and Marcello were safe for now. They were taken to the hospital, where Marcello received further treatment for his injuries, and Alessia was examined for any harm. They were questioned by the police, providing them with the evidence they had gathered, exposing the syndicate's crimes, revealing Balducci's treachery, bringing justice to their world. They were hailed as heroes, as saviors, as survivors. But they knew that the fight was not over, that the syndicate was still out there, that their enemies were still lurking, that their love would be tested again. It was, however, a turning point, one that neither of them could ever take back. Chapter 20. Redemption's Embrace. The aftermath of the escape and Balducci's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The media hailed Alessia and Marcello as heroes, exposing the syndicate's crimes and bringing down one of the city's most notorious criminals. The police, armed with the evidence they had provided, launched a massive investigation, arresting corrupt officials, dismantling the syndicate's network, and seizing their assets. Marcello, recovering from his injuries, was lauded for his bravery, his resilience, his leadership. But he knew that the victory was not his alone. It was Alessia who had been the driving force, the strategist, the heart of their rebellion. Alessia, in turn, was praised for her courage, her intelligence, her compassion. She had become a symbol of hope, a champion for the oppressed, a voice for the voiceless. But she knew that her journey was far from over, that she still had much to do, much to heal. Dr. Gabinelli, hailed as a whistleblower, was granted immunity and entered witness protection, his testimony crucial in the prosecution of Balducci and his associates. He had found redemption, a chance to atone for his past, to start anew. Sal DeMarco's betrayal remained a deep wound for Alessia, a painful reminder of the fragility of trust, the darkness that lurked within even the closest of families. But she found solace in the knowledge that he had, in his final moments, shown a flicker of remorse, a hint of regret. As the dust settled, Alessia and Marcello faced a new challenge, rebuilding their lives, redefining their relationship, forging a future together. They had been brought together by violence, by betrayal, by forced circumstances. But they had chosen to stay together, to fight together, to love each other. They decided to leave the Palazzo Ricci, the symbol of their past, the prison of their forced marriage, the scene of so much pain and loss. They moved to a smaller villa, a place of their own, a sanctuary where they could heal, where they could be themselves. Marcello, inspired by Alessia's compassion and her unwavering belief in justice, began to transform the Ricci empire, shifting its focus from illicit activities to legitimate businesses, investing in the community, creating opportunities for the people, giving back to the city that had been ravaged by violence and corruption. He sought to create his own redemption. Alessia, in turn, returned to her art, her passion, her solace. She painted again, not the landscapes and cityscapes of her past, but portraits of the people she had met, the survivors, the victims, the heroes. She captured their stories, their resilience, their hope. She also established a foundation dedicated to helping the victims of organized crime, providing them with shelter, education, and a chance at a new life. She became an advocate for change, a voice for justice, a beacon of light in the darkness. Their love, born in the crucible of adversity, blossomed and grew, becoming a source of strength, of comfort, of inspiration. They had found each other in the midst of chaos, in the heart of darkness, and they had chosen to embrace the light, to create a future together. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace of their new villa, watching the sunset over the city, Marcello turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a love that was both tender and profound. "I never thought I could be happy, Alessia," he said, his voice soft. "I never thought I could love. But you changed everything." She smiled, her heart overflowing with a love that was both fierce and gentle. "And you, Marcello," she replied, "you showed me that even in the darkest of worlds, there is hope. There is light." He reached out, taking her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a symbol of their unity, their partnership, their love. "We have a long way to go," he said, "but we'll do it together. We'll build a better future, a better world, for ourselves, for our children." Alessia's eyes widened slightly. It was an unspoken thing between them, something they had not yet discussed. And yet she leaned in, pressing her lips to his, a kiss that was both passionate and promising. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, their future, their redemption. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. They had found love in the ruins, and they had built a new life on the foundations of hope, of justice, of redemption. They had made the choice. And now they would live with it. Together. Always. And as Alessia looked out on the horizon, finally, she was at peace. The final chapter of their story had closed. And a new beginning was just on the horizon. Epilogue. 5 years passed. The city, once scarred by violence and corruption, had begun to heal, to rebuild, to thrive. The syndicate's grip had been broken, its leaders imprisoned, its assets seized. The streets were safer, the people more hopeful, the future brighter. Alessia and Marcello, living in their peaceful villa, had become pillars of the community, their names synonymous with justice, with compassion, with change. The Ricci empire, transformed into a legitimate business conglomerate, was a force for good, creating jobs, supporting local initiatives, and investing in the future. Alessia's foundation flourished, providing shelter, education, and support to countless victims of organized crime, helping them to rebuild their lives, to find hope, to heal. Her art, exhibited in galleries around the world, told the stories of the survivors, their resilience, their courage, their triumph over adversity. And their love had deepened, matured, becoming a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of redemption, a symbol of their enduring bond. They had 2 children. A boy, Antonio, named after Alessia's father, a strong, determined child with his mother's eyes and his father's spirit. And a girl, Isabella, a bright, compassionate child with her father's smile and her mother's heart. They raised their children in a world free from the shadows of the Mafia, a world where justice prevailed, where compassion mattered, where love conquered all. They taught them the values of honesty, integrity, and kindness. They showed them the importance of fighting for what is right, of standing up for the oppressed, of making a difference. One warm summer evening, as the family gathered on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, Alessia felt a profound sense of peace, of contentment, of gratitude. She looked at Marcello, his arm around her waist, his eyes filled with a love that had only grown stronger with time. She looked at her children, playing happily on the lawn, their laughter echoing in the twilight, their faces radiant with joy. She had found her happiness, her purpose, her redemption. She had escaped the gilded cage, broken free from the chains of her past, and created a future filled with love, with hope, with light. Marcello leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, a silent promise of forever, a testament to their enduring bond. "We did it, Alessia," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We made it." She smiled, her heart overflowing with a love that knew no bounds. "Yes, my love," she replied.
We did.
And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Alessia knew that their journey had been long, arduous, and filled with pain. But it had also been a journey of transformation, of growth, of redemption. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged victorious. They had found love in the ruins, and they had built a new life, a new world, a new legacy. A legacy of hope, of justice, of love. A legacy that would endure, long after they were gone, a testament to the power of the human spirit, the resilience of the human heart, the triumph of good over evil. Alessia closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her husband and children, the peace of a well-fought battle, and a future brighter than she had ever imagined, finally within reach. The end.